"You gonna plant all 320? Not this year." That was the whole conversation. Two sentences across a fence line in Mercer County, Ohio, in the second week of April 1984. Bud Calloway was on his tractor, idling down to talk. His neighbor Arlen Voss was walking the field edge, checking soil temperature before his first tillage pass. Bud nodded and drove on. They had farmed adjacent ground for 19 years. They did not need more words than that. The payment-in-kind program had ended in 1983, but what replaced it in 1984 was structurally similar and aimed at the same problem: too much corn in American storage, not enough price to make growing it worthwhile. The corn price in Ohio in the spring of 1984 was trading around $2.65 per bushel. The cost of producing a bushel of corn in Mercer County, land, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, equipment, ran approximately $2.80 to $3.10 per acre bushel, depending on the operation. At $2.65, every bushel of corn grown in western Ohio in 1984 was being grown at a loss. Not a small loss, a structural loss, the kind that had been building since 1981, and that did not have a market solution in sight, because the problem was not scarcity. The problem was abundance. Ohio in 1984 was not the epicenter of the farm crisis in the way that Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas were. The crisis in those states had been amplified by land values that had peaked higher, debt loads that had climbed further, and the particular concentration of grain farming that left operators with fewer options when commodity prices fell. Western Ohio had its own version of the same pressure, not as acute, but present in the same ways. Land values that had risen through the late 1970s were now falling. The operating loans that had made sense at $1,800 per acre, land values, made less sense at $1,200. The margin between the cost of production and the market price had been negative for corn for 2 years and showed no sign of correcting on its own. The federal acreage reduction program was the government's attempt to reduce supply by paying producers to reduce planted acreage. The mechanics of the program were complicated in their specifics, but simple in their logic. If farmers planted less corn would be produced, prices would eventually rise, and the structural loss built into every bushel grown in 1984 would resolve itself. The program worked partially. It did not work fully. And in the gap between what it offered and what individual farmers with above-average ground could earn by planting, men like Arlen Voss did their own math and reached their own conclusions. The federal government's response was a program that paid farmers to not plant. The mechanics varied by year and by crop, but the 1984 structure offered participating corn growers a payment in cash and commodity certificates in exchange for removing a specified percentage of their base acreage from production. The payment was calculated on established yield history and was designed to be competitive with, or in good years, slightly better than, the expected return from planting and selling the corn at market. Bud Calloway had signed up for the program in March. He was 58 years old and had farmed 320 acres in Mercer County since 1968, when he had taken over from his father-in-law after the older man's retirement. His operation was corn and soybeans in a standard rotation, the same crops, on the same ground more or less for 16 years. He carried a land note that he had refinanced in 1981 when rates had been high and he had not had much choice, and that he was now servicing at 12.5% with 7 years remaining. His equipment was paid off. His operating line was modest. He was not in crisis. He was operating close enough to zero margin that a bad year could put him there. He was going to fallow 40 acres of his best ground, take the government payment on that acreage, and plant the remaining 280 acres to corn and soybeans. His calculation, worked out on a legal pad over 2 evenings in February, showed that the program payment on 40 acres plus the crop revenue on 280 acres came out ahead of planting all 320, assuming the corn price held where it was and did not recover meaningfully before harvest. He had assumed it would not recover. He had been right about that assumption for 3 years running and had no particular reason to think 1984 would be different. Arlen Voss was 52 years old and had farmed the adjacent 320 acres since 1972, when he had bought out his brother's share of the home place after their father's estate was settled. His operation was structured similarly to Bud's. Corn and soybeans, same rotation, comparable acreage. Where they differed was in the ground itself. Arlen's farm had a natural advantage in the southeast corner, a section of ground with deep, well-drained silt loam that consistently outperformed the county average. That 40 acres had never yielded below 120 bushels per acre in 12 years of his management. In good years, it ran 138 to 142. Arlen had not signed up. He was going to plant all 320 acres. Arlen's reasoning was different from Bud's, and it was not wrong. It was a different reading of the same set of facts. The program's fundamental design flaw, from the perspective of a grower with above-average ground, was that it paid on history, not on potential. It looked backward at what your ground had produced on average and paid you to not produce that average amount. If your ground was average, the payment approximated your opportunity cost reasonably well. If your ground was better than average, the payment systematically undercompensated you for what you were giving up. This was not a secret. County extension offices across Ohio had run the numbers and published them. The farmers who were most likely to opt out of the program were the ones who already knew their ground outperformed the formula. Arlen did not need the extension office to tell him what his southeast 40 acres did every September. He had been watching that corner of the farm for 12 years. After 12 years, you don't just know the average. You know which corner stays wet in a cold spring, which field dries out first, where a good yield number actually means something and where it's just the floor. Arlen knew what that Southeast 40 was capable of. The government's formula didn't. And when somebody hands you a payment based on a number that doesn't match what you're standing in front of, that's a hard line to sign on. It's not stubbornness. You just know what you know. The acreage reduction program paid on established base acreage and yield history. Arlen's base yield, the 5-year average that the program used to calculate payments, was 118 bushels per acre, which was the county average and reflected his ground accurately. At the program's payment rate, the 40 acres Bud was fallowing would generate a payment of approximately $1,190. Arlen had looked at that number and decided it was not enough. His reasoning was this. He had 40 acres of ground in the southeast corner of his farm that ran consistently above county average, 130 to 140 bushels per acre in normal years, 125, even in a dry year. That ground was not average ground. The program paid him as if it were. If he planted that ground and hit 132 bushels per acre at $2.65, his gross on those 40 acres was $14,006. The program would have paid him $1,190 to leave it empty. He was leaving $12,816 on the table to collect $1,190. That math did not work for him, so he planted. What neither man knew in April of 1984 was exactly how the season would unfold. That is always true in farming and is not a criticism of either decision. They were making probability assessments in April with information that was available in April, and the information available in April 1984 pointed toward a continued weak corn market. What actually happened to the corn price in the fall of 1984 was that it stayed weak. It did not recover. The harvest time price in Ohio came in around $2.48 per bushel, lower than the spring price, not higher. Bud's calculation had assumed the price would hold at $2.65. It had fallen to $2.48. His program enrolled acreage had paid at a rate fixed in the spring, which was now slightly above the harvest price. The 40 acres he had fallowed had returned more per acre than if he had planted them, not because the program payment was generous, but because the market price had declined further than he had modeled. His total return for 1984 across 280 planted acres plus the program payment on 40 came to approximately $74,800. Arlen had planted all 320 acres. His average yield came in at 121 bushels per acre, slightly below his best grounds potential because a wet June had created some drainage issues in the southeast corner that had knocked the yield back from its typical performance. 121 bushels at $2.48 on 320 acres came to $96,067. More acres, more bushels, more gross revenue, more cost. Arlen's variable costs on 320 acres, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, ran approximately $68,000. His gross minus variable costs was $28,067. Bud's variable costs on 280 acres ran $59,500. His gross crop revenue minus variable costs was $38,780. Add the program payment of $1,190 and his net contribution margin was $39,970. Arlen had more gross revenue. Bud had better margin. I want to stop here because it's easy to read this as Bud made the right call and Arlen made the wrong one. But flip the price. Corn comes in at $2.85 instead of $2.48, and the whole thing reverses. Same two men, same decisions, same ground. Now Arlen's the smart one, and Bud left money on the table. The only thing that separated a good decision from a bad one in this story was 17 cents. That's it. Not skill, not judgment, just where the price landed. Neither man had made a mistake. That is the part of this story that is easiest to miss and most important to understand. Arlen had correctly identified that his southeast 40 acres were above average ground that the program undervalued. He had correctly calculated that planting them at $2.65 would outperform the program payment, if the price held. The price had not held. It had fallen 17 cents between April and October, which had changed the outcome but had not made his reasoning wrong. Bud had correctly identified that the program payment, locked in at spring prices, provided a hedge against a continued price decline. He had correctly assessed that his operations margins were thin enough that reducing variable cost exposure was more valuable than maximizing gross revenue. He had made the same judgment that farmers across the Corn Belt were making in the spring of 1984, and it had come out slightly better than Arlen's approach in this particular year. In a year when the corn price had recovered to $3.10 by harvest, the outcome would have been reversed. Arlen would have had the better margin, Bud would have left money on the table by fallowing productive acres for a payment that underperformed the market. They both knew this. They had talked about it in November, after the harvest was in and the settlement sheets were done. The way farmers talk about decisions after the outcome is known, not with recrimination, not with the false confidence of hindsight, but with the genuine curiosity of two people who had looked at the same situation and reached different conclusions and were now comparing notes. Bud had come out ahead in 1984. He said so and did not make more of it than that. Arlen had come out behind on margin, but had kept his full operation running and his equipment utilized and his ground producing, which mattered for reasons that did not show up in the 1984 numbers: soil health, crop rotation, the planted acres base that would determine his program payments in future years if he decided to enroll. He said so, and Bud nodded. They were both right. That was the conversation. The November conversation lasted about 20 minutes. They were standing at the end of Bud's drive, where the county road ran between the two farms, in the kind of late autumn afternoon that comes after harvest is done, and the pressure of the season has lifted, and there is finally time to think about what happened and why. Bud had brought out 2 cups of coffee. They stood there with the cups and talked through the numbers the way they had been talking through harvest numbers for 19 years, without competition, without the need for one of them to be right and the other wrong, with the particular frankness that comes from knowing someone long enough that there is no point in performance. Bud said his land note payment in November had felt less difficult than it had in recent years. Not easy. Less difficult. Arlen said his operation had produced more bushels than Bud's and had cost more to produce them, and that in 1984 the math had worked against him, and that in a year with a different price outcome the same approach would have worked in his favor. Bud agreed that was true. Arlen said he was going to look more carefully at the 1985 program before deciding whether to sign up. He said the formula for calculating base yield payments had not kept pace with what his best ground was actually producing, and, until it did, the program was asking him to accept below-market compensation for above-market ground. Bud said that sounded right and that he understood why Arlen had made the choice he had made. They finished their coffee. Arlen drove home. Neither of them told the other what to do in 1985. The 1984 acreage reduction program enrolled approximately 30% of eligible corn acreage nationally, less than the USDA had projected when designing the program and less than was needed to meaningfully reduce the surplus. Farmers like Arlen, who had above-average ground and above-average yields that the program's formula did not capture accurately, had rationally opted out. Farmers like Bud, who were operating on thin margins and valued the certainty of a locked payment over the uncertainty of the market, had rationally opted in. The program had not failed. It had encountered the basic problem that any program based on average calculations encounters when applied to a population with above-average variance. The farmers who have the most to gain from not participating are the ones most likely to opt out. In Mercer County, Ohio, that dynamic had played out across a fence line in 2 sentences in April. In November, it had been re-examined over 2 cups of coffee at the end of a gravel drive. Neither man had been wrong. They had just chosen differently. If the system penalizes production, do you plant less or double down? What would you have done in Bud's position? In Arlen's? Leave a comment.